go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. We'll return to Lama Tsongkhapa's text. And for those who have the text that are following along, we're on page 256. And so here in this section, right, we're in a section where Lama Tsongkhapa is teaching on how to actually meditate on emptiness, right? Which is what this, which we're in the long section on emptiness. So Lama Tsongkhapa gave all the introductory kind of comments about emptiness, and now he's teaching how do you actually meditate on emptiness. And one point, just a small point, I was just the other day I was listening to a recording of His Holiness the Dalai Lama teaching on Majjhimaka, right, which is what this is also, Majjhimaka, right? And His Holiness was saying, that he was talking about Tibet, Nalanda, right, in India, the great Nalanda tradition of Buddhism, that Tibet, and His Holiness always says the Tibetans uphold, right, the tradition of Buddhism that comes from Nalanda University in India, the great scholars of Buddhism. And then he said, that one of the great masters of Nalanda was one of the people who brought Buddhism to Tibet, right, Shantarakshita. And he was pointing out that Shantarakshita was a great proponent of logic and of reason and of analysis, and he was saying, and His Holiness was saying that from its very beginnings, Buddhism itself and then Buddhism as it came to Tibet is a tradition grounded in reason and in debate and in analysis, and you can see that obviously in this chapter for those who are following along. And His Holiness often says that, right? That like Buddhism is not some one should approach Buddhism. What does he say? Basically, we should approach Buddhism as the Nalanda masters did, right? With a sense of asking questions and contemplating and using reason. So anyway, so in this section, it's very clear, right, that Lama Tsongkhapa is saying. It's actually interesting, right? Because what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, I just want to remind everybody, is that if somebody realizes emptiness, the first time a person realizes emptiness, it's through a process of reasoning, I'll put it that way, of reasoned analysis, right? And that a person has to contemplate, you hear the words, and that gives you some idea of emptiness, but that you have to, for yourself, right, go through a process of checking and reasoning very deeply, and really contemplating what do these words mean, and what does emptiness mean? What is, I would think that, like there's this phrase, right? Because things are dependently arisen, they're empty. And because things are empty, they can function as dependent arising. It's a very simple statement, right? It's actually a statement of reasoning. Right? But you have to really contemplate deeply, what does dependent arising mean? Right? And what does empty mean? If you don't know what empty means, then of course it just sounds... And at one point also, like sometimes people think, Lama Tsongkhapa, if you've been studying, if you've been following along, right? Sometimes people take some of the statements like these as if they're just like paradoxes or something, almost like a paradox that's not knowable. And Lama Tsongkhapa is basically, he's been over and over again saying, no, don't take it that way. Like, contemplate it, reason it out, think about it deeply, and that you have to understand the meaning, right, of these statements. Because like there's a statement, what is that one? That which is dependently arisen is unarisen. Now at first glance that just sounds like a paradox, doesn't it? Like, it's just an unknowable paradox. But Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, no, that's not an unknowable paradox. He's saying, and he goes through all these reasons why, right? He says, like, if you take that to mean it's completely unarisen, that would be meaningless. So it can't mean that. It doesn't mean that. And Lama Tsongkhapa goes through and analyzes what does that mean. So we shouldn't leave these statements just as sort of statements or as unknowable paradoxes. We should contemplate them deeply, is what Lama Tsongkhapa, the Dalai Lama, and the previous masters, Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna, are saying. So that I just want to remind everybody of that. And so here, I'm going to have to go backwards slightly just to remind everybody where we're at. So Lama Tsongkhapa is in the section on how to meditate on the emptiness or non-inherent existence, right? Emptiness means empty of inherent existence. Again, you have to contemplate deeply, what does inherent existence mean? But we're on how to settle or reason or realize the lack of inherent existence of yourself as a person, right? So the emptiness of self, the lack of inherent existence of self. And last time we covered the first two of the four, I think. But Lama Tsongkhapa said he presents one method. There he presents various methods of meditation in this text, but this for the emptiness of self, he particularly presents this 4-step process. Right? And so I'm just going to very briefly review the first 2 steps, which we covered last time, and then I'm going to emphasize the last 2 steps. So the first step is, he says, you must ascertain the object of negation. And that's at the top of 256. And he basically says, which is true, that he covered that in great detail earlier in this text, so he doesn't cover it a lot here. Right? But in many ways, I'll just remind you, that's the, actually, for example, Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche often says, that's the most important point, is to correctly identify the object of negation. You know, because what you're not negating is existence, or is the self does exist. Right? So you're not negating that the self exists. But emptiness, the point is, emptiness means empty of something, right? What is it empty of? And if you don't know what it's empty of, then you're not going to have a meaningful contemplation of emptiness, right? And so Lama Tsongkhapa covered in great detail, right? So we could say it's the inherently existent I, or self, right? Or it's the intrinsically existent self, or it's the self that's independent. He uses different words, right? The self that exists by its own nature or from its own side. You know. So those are various like phrases that different Buddhist masters use to try to get at what is that object of negation. And I'll just remind you one more, again, because I've said this, but so we have to contemplate very deeply in our own experience, right? You can't say the inherently existent self, it's innate, right? He also makes that point. This is not a philosophically acquired idea of self, right? This is an idea of self that we have in common with animals, for example. It's innate in that sense. It's instinctual, and what he's getting at is a very subtle distinction, right? There's a self that exists, but then there's a self that we grasp at that's non-existent, and you have to identify, and you believe it exists, so it's not easy to identify it, right? And so they have these different techniques, right? You know those. So like, you've heard these, probably, you know, like, you know, so sometimes you imagine like a moment when you've been falsely accused of something, or you think of a moment when you've been very upset, right? And there's this very powerful, concrete sense of self, right, that exists sometimes. You feel it in your chest or something. You actually feel it in your body, right? And that's like what's the word? I would say that's like you know, for us as beginners, that's a way to start to identify that. Does that make sense? Then you still have to say, well, what's the difference between that and the self that exists? You have to actually think about it, right? Because it's not, you know, so if you think like somebody insulted you, and then you feel the sense of, I didn't do that, right? So then you're starting, right? You're going, okay, well, that feeling is something. The Buddhist texts say that. Like, identify that feeling and then stay with it and hold on to it. But then you have to start to analyze. This is just identifying the object of negation, right? Well, what is that self? Where did that come from? In what sense does that exist, right? And how do I experience that self? And so you're trying over time to identify how you grasp at your own sense of self, right? And you'll find, right, it's very concrete. It's very, it seems like it exists right there, doesn't it? It seems sort of solid. You know? It seems like it always existed, right? Not like it's something you're constructing. One text, Khyentse Rinpoche pointed this out in the book, Easy Path. He says, like, you know, he gives this, he takes it from another Buddhist master. He says, if a person is like in a dark room and they're walking, and they're like going like that, and suddenly they feel something like a pillar, it's like, even though they can't see it, they suddenly have the sense of the pillars, even though they just touched one, like their finger touched a little spot, immediately their mind gives rise to a whole image of pillar, and it feels like that pillar was always there. Right? And that Buddhist master says the self is like that. It seems complete and always there. He's just giving analogies for how it feels. And so different Buddhist masters have given different instructions on how do you find that sense of self that seems like it exists inherently, independently, from its own side, intrinsically. And so remember, this is the most important point. Right? The first step is to identify correctly that object of negation. And he points out, I'll just make one last point about this too, because Lama Tsongkhapa points out in this text a little, and also particularly in his great treatise, the longer Lamrim text, that there's a danger also, because if you identify a sense of self that's too narrow, that's not the actual object of negation, but is sort of what's the word? Yeah, too narrow or not complete enough, then you can negate that, but you won't realize emptiness. You'll be negating something that maybe is negatable, is not true, but that's not emptiness. You're negating something more superficial. Does that make sense? On the other hand, if you create too broad a sense of the object of negation, if you negate every sense of existence, then you become nihilistic, and that's definitely not emptiness. That's actually considered an evil view. So that's why it's important to correctly identify. So and many Buddhist masters have done that. Actually, have made those mistakes. Many Buddhist teachers, many Buddhist teachers have made that. Lama Tsongkhapa says this. I'm not making it up. He says that. He says many Buddhist teachers, even in Tibet, sort of made those mistakes where they thought, well, nothing exists. They negated everything, which is not true. Of course, things exist, right? I mean, when somebody's in pain, they're in pain. You have empathy for that, and sympathy, and compassion. You can't say that just doesn't exist. That's ridiculous, right? Also, just if you take a drink, that exists, right? Like if you eat something, that exists. So on the one hand, if you negate everything, that's a ludicrous wrong view of nihilism. But also, there's the danger of negating too little. So like, and that's where he gives this analogy. He says it's like if your enemy is in the west and you fight something in the east or something. It's like you're not addressing the real cause of your own suffering, and so then you'll continue to suffer. So we have to correctly identify the object.
So my question is so how do you decide that it's too little? Say it's too little, or it's just a negation of it becomes, or how do you decide it's too little, or how do you decide which object? Because they're all names, right? Mm-hmm. How do you decide which name to negate?
The only way to do it, I think, is to continually, so you keep studying these topics, like in different texts, the different Buddhist teachers, and then you keep meditating, comparing, relating your own experience, right?
Yeah.
And so you have to find your own experience, and then you go back. Because actually, if you do it deeply enough, if you really meditate deeply, this is my own observation, is we will make mistakes. In other words, if you go off and meditate, right? Of course, you're not going to first, we're not going to first correctly identify it perfectly. But so part of it is that you meditate, so you study a text or you study your teacher, taught something, like your Lama. Then you meditate for a while and you identify some experience and you use that. And then you go back and you compare it, to the text or to your teacher, or you ask the teacher, or you look at the book you're studying. And then you go meditate more. And then you again compare it. And gradually you get closer and closer. That's the idea. Okay. Then the second point, which we covered last time, so this one I won't go into too much detail again, but is, he calls it the essential point of ascertaining the pervasion. Right? And so pervasion means, is a term, as I said last time, for Buddhist logic, logic, reason. And what it's saying is, in general, pervasion, right, I said this last time, so just very briefly, they often give this example, so I think I used it last time, of where there's smoke, there's fire. Right? So the idea is that wherever you see thick billowing smoke, there's fire there. Right? And so the idea here is that, so pervasion is a logical, it's like you're asserting a logical assertion, right? Here the logical assertion is not about smoke and fire, though. Here the pervasion is, if that object of negation, that self, exists, I'm going to put it simply, then it must be either one thing or many things. Because anything that exists has to be either singular or plural. There's no other category. Right? So that's the pervasion. That's the logical assertion here. So then you can guess where we're going if you understand Buddhist logic, right? So that you identify the object of negation, the particular sense of self. Then you're asserting this logical pervasion, which again I covered last time, so I'm not going into huge detail. But in brief, it's either one or it's many. It's either singular or plural, right? Because anything that exists, if it truly exists, and this is the idea, if something really exists, it has to either be singular or plural. If it's true, if it's inherently existent from its own side, as a specific thing, that, if you made up something, if something exists in mere name, then you can be flexible. But if something exists from its own side intrinsically and truly, then it has to either be one thing or many things. That's what they're saying. That's a better way to put that, actually. So now, he's saying, then the last 2 points are, one is, the third point is seeing that the person seeing that it's not one, and the last point is seeing it's not many. So if it must exist as one or many, and then you can realize it's not one, and you can realize it's not many, then you can realize that object of negation has been negated. It can't exist as you perceived it. That makes sense, right? You get the point there. And so, yeah, that's the brief. He goes through those briefly, but we'll go through it in a more detailed way. So because first he briefly says those are the 4 points. And then he says, now I'm going to go into more detail about the third point, and then I'm going to go into more detail about the fourth point. Right? And so in this third point, he starts to relate the sense of the self, right? And I don't mean the mere, like, the self that's been the object of negation. Whatever. Now in this context, there are different meanings of the word self, and he said that earlier, by the way, for those who remember. He says, one use of the word self is the self that exists, right? Because there is a self that exists. We'll get into later what that is. But here when we use self, when he's using self, it's the second kind of self, the self that doesn't exist, right? The object of negation. So right now we're going to be, when we say self, when I use that word, I'm referring to the object of negation in this context. Does that make sense? So he's saying, so here, I'll read the actual line. He says, the third essential point is refuting that the self and the aggregates are inherently one. And so we'll go into that. In this regard, if the self and the aggregates were one inherently established entity, he says there would be 3 faults. So now he's doing a logical analysis. And I'll go through all 3 points. So one point, so what are the aggregates? The aggregates are your body and mind, in brief, right? You can say there are 5 aggregates, we'll go through those, but in brief, it's the body and mind. Right? If you go through the 5, right, then what is it? Form, which is the body, feelings, discriminations, what they call compositional factors, and consciousness. And so, the first meaning is this, actually, even these have subpoints, so we'll go through this slowly. The very first thing he says it would be pointless to assert a self. So there what he's saying is, if the aggregates were inherently the self, if they were intrinsically the self, then there would be no then the word self would have no meaning, actually. It would just be the aggregates. Right? And then he makes another point. He says, if they were the same entity, if the sameness of entity of the two were inherently established, they would be permanently and indivisibly one. Right? So what he's getting at here, you have to think about this meaning, inherently established as one. Right? It means truly one, or intrinsically one, or one by their very nature, the self and the body and mind. Right? And then he makes a point. So actually, I'll read this because it's quite interesting and subtle. He says, this is because if their sameness of entity were ultimately established, then whatever mind those two appear to, they would necessarily not appear to be different. The reason for this is that although among falsities, mere conventional things, it is not contradictory for the mode of appearance and the mode of subsistence to be discordant, those two are necessarily contradictory in something established as true, because something truly established appears to a mind must appear just the way it is. So here what he's saying is this, is if the body and the mind were intrinsically the self, they would have to always appear that way to everybody. And they would have to kind of appear the same to everybody. So no, there's something where if something is like, and what he's getting at is this, is like, I'll just give a more superficial example for a second to get what he's getting at. Like when you have somebody who you think is your best friend, right? They appear to you in a certain way, friend, right? Like you see them and you immediately smile and you think, oh, they're wonderful, right? And you feel, well, they're really, that's my friend right there. You know, it's not this other person, it's not the light lamp, it's that person. They're my friend. They're wonderful, beautiful, excellent person, right? And it appears like that they exist that way from their own side, right? Intrinsically, like friend and that person are completely mixed, right? And what he's getting at here is a point like this. If that person were intrinsically friend, then the first time you saw them, you would have had to see their friend. Everyone who sees them would have to see their friend, because that's who they are from their own side intrinsically. But of course, somebody else looks at your best friend and thinks, oh, they are so annoying. They're terrible. Like, and they think, when they look at them, they see intrinsically an annoying enemy, right? Somebody else looks at your friend and they think, they're nobody. They're not a friend, they're not an enemy, they're meaningless. They're like irrelevant to my life. Right? And so, what he's getting at here is this, is if things existed, in this case I'm using a more superficial example, friendness or something, right? If it existed intrinsically from the side of the object, or inherently from the side of the object, or naturally by nature, if it were the nature of that object to be friend, he's saying that everyone would have to see that, because that's the nature of that object. Yep.
Let me, because this really resounds to me. If my nature, if everything is inherently existing, that doesn't mean that there couldn't be external attributes. I mean, I'm making this up as I go along. Because I don't like your example. It doesn't get at what I'm feeling, which is like there is inherently something going on there. And this thing of friend, husband, father, it feels a bit external. It doesn't feel like it's getting at really what's going on in there. So, but the description of the aggregates and the self really feels like, well, that's me. I'm really something that doesn't change. Clearly there's things changing all around me and in me and yada yada. So I don't like the example, but the description of that point really hits home. So
yeah, and just to be clear, I was using that more superficial example, just to try to get it.
It does feel like a
what
superficial
he's getting
description of that person or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah, and husband is a more superficial example that one can use. My only point was like you could use the example of husband, where a person might feel that, or father or something. But those are superficial. Then you have to get to what you're trying to describe, which is the sense of self itself, which is the most fundamental. Right? It's much more fundamental than any other label.
So is that any different from the innate that we were talking about, point one?
No, what you're describing is the object of negation. Actually, when you said it feels unchanging,
Right.
that's the object. You said that's the object of negation.
Yeah. It's not going anywhere.
No, and that's because we have to like Lama Tsongkhapa makes a point actually a little later in this where he says, it's difficult to really. You have to go through all these points and really realize them and really contemplate them deeply in order to actually experientially negate that. So it's not easy to negate it either. And he's going through how do you do that. But so part of it is you have to identify that sense of where you're describing the sense of self it feels, in your case you said, feels unchanging. Right? And then you have to say, well, I mean he's going to go through various reasonings here, but the first one, right, is like again, one is, well, if that's one with the aggregates, he's going to go through various reasonings here. The first one is if that's one with the aggregates, first of all, then why call it self? It's just aggregates, right? Another is, it would have to, how do you say it? Always appear the same. You know, and we're going to go through more reasonings, but you'd have to check for yourself, well, is that real or not? You know,
On more reflection, it doesn't really feel like it's one with the aggregates. It just feels like the aggregates are, you know, something that I'm controlling, like, you know, a robot or something like that.
And there, again, so that feeling that you just described, Chandrakirti addresses that in his sevenfold reason, which Lama Tsongkhapa is going to address too. In that one, it's that idea is that the self is other than the aggregates, right? If it's a controller, then it's other than the aggregates, which is going to be the fourth of the 4 points, is disproving that the self exists as something separate from the aggregate, right? Because if the self is a controller of the aggregates, it would imply that it somehow exists as something separate from them that can control it. Like a person gets in a car and controls the car, the person is not one with the car, right? So that feeling or that view or whatever is addressed in the fourth of the 4 points, that the self doesn't exist as separate from the
Didn't mean to jump ahead.
No, that's okay. That's good though. I mean, you're identifying it experientially though, which is the point. And that's what this is supposed to do. And actually, if you meditate deeply, sometimes it'll happen, right, where you feel like the self is one with the aggregates, and then as you start to disprove that, you start to feel, oh, okay, it exists separate from the aggregate. Like it sort of jumps to the other category, and you have to hold this. And Buddhist masters in their descriptions say, but you have to keep holding on to that sense of the object of negation to go, okay, well now I think it's separate, and then you have to negate that until finally you negate it. So you can't just let it run off, so to speak. You have to kind of keep holding on to it and watching it. You know, yeah. Did somebody else have you had a question?
Yeah,
Or you did.
Dr.
I had somewhere.
So in this example, when you say love or friendship, looking at the subject and object here. So the self is looking at a feeling here, right? Saying this is my love, this is my friend, and so on and so forth. So would this be an example of selfness of phenomenon which is other?
Yeah. Yeah, so that would be a self as a phenomenon, actually. I mean, because it's another person. Yes, that's true. And again, I was just using that example. Ultimately, here we're meditating on the self, though.
Yeah, so you're not looking at yourself, but you're looking at the object, other, and the feeling that it invokes in you, which is friendliness or lovingness or whatever.
I see. Well, I should make it clear. In the meditation we're actually studying, it's meditating on the emptiness of yourself. You know, that's the actual top. But in my example of friend, there it's appearing like it's out there. So it would be of the object itself, that the object is not intrinsically or inherently friend. I was just using that as an example, but the main meditation is on the emptiness of the I, or your sense of self. So maybe my example was actually more confusing.
So where does that feeling that you feel, which is the object of negation, come from?
It comes from, according to Buddhism, it comes from what they call a beginningless habit of ignorance. So it comes from the previous moment of ignorance, and that comes from the previous moment of ignorance, and that comes from. So it's like a habit. It comes from a habit that always has a previous moment of habit.
So there have never been a moment when Tao wasn't there.
Yep. Yeah, until somebody realizes emptiness, there's never been a moment that wasn't true.
But that knowledge comes from the mind too as well.
Yeah.
The knowledge with which you are trying to solve the knowledge you are trying to solve these come from the mind. How come the mind does not automatically realize that itself?
How come the mind? How come the mind doesn't automatically realize emptiness?
Yeah.
Actually, I'll say that because everything depends on causes. Buddhism says everything depends on causes and conditions.
Yeah.
So as long as the causes and conditions, because everything is dependently arising or interdependent, that's the Buddhist view, right? So as long as the causes and conditions are there for ignorance to grasp that it inherently is in self, then one will inevitably, because everything depends on whatever the causes are. So if the causes are the habit of ignorance, then ignorance will continue. And the mind will only stop grasping at that when the causes for stopping grasping at that are present. Because even wisdom is dependently arisen.
Which are what created those causes at first place anyway?
The causes of ignorance or wisdom?
Both.
The causes of ignorance were the previous ignorance. And the cause of wisdom is study, contemplating, and meditating on these topics.
Yeah.
Okay. So that, okay, so then he goes on. Let's go through this carefully here. So he says, oh, okay, next he makes another, actually, I'll just say it this way. He makes another point here, which is, he makes various points to refute that the self and the aggregates are one entity. Another point he makes, as he's going through this section here, is about, actually I'll read the actual quote from Nagarjuna. He says, once you understand that apart from the appropriated aggregates there is no self, the appropriated aggregates themselves can only be the self. That self of yours does not exist. And what Lama Tsongkhapa here is talking about, well, he makes a number of points that are implicit in that, and one he actually says explicitly here. So one is, if the self were one with the aggregates, intrinsically, inherently, then also there are many other problems that start to arise, actually. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit, even some things that are in what he says and also implied by what he says. One point is, and again, obviously, it comes from the perspective of Buddhism, which asserts reincarnation, right, rebirth. So one point is, if you were inherently one with the aggregates, then you couldn't take rebirth, because if you were inherently one with that body, well, that body dies, right? So the self would end, or something like that, which Buddhism says is not true. But actually, the same point would apply, for example, if you looked at a young child and an adult, right? If you said, well, I'm intrinsically one with these aggregates, actually, right now, if you said I'm intrinsically one with these aggregates, but then when you reach, if you live to old age, and then you're like in a different, your body's different, then you're intrinsically one with those aggregates. Doesn't make sense, does it? So that's one point. Anyways, it doesn't allow for changes of the aggregates, and the aggregates change. Another point that's implied in this is actually what Paul was actually getting at, and this is implicit here. But oftentimes we say, like, sometimes we identify with the aggregates, and other times we identify a self that seems apart from, like, so for example, you might say, my hand hurts. Well, how can, if you are one with the aggregates, how can your hand hurt? You are like your hand is intrinsically you. You know, and then also if somebody were to have an operation where part of the aggregates were taken out, like the gallbladder was taken away out. Well, how would that work? If you're intrinsically and inherently one with everything, you know, we try to get at the Buddhist perspective here, right? If the self is just a conceptual label, like a label of a conceptual mind upon these changing aggregates, then of course that's fine, it's flexible. Right? But if you're intrinsically and inherently and solidly and independently one with the aggregates, well then if somebody had their gallbladder taken out, they're not them anymore? Or the gallbladder's them when it goes in the medical waste? Like, you start to see the problems. He's getting at, this is the problem of inherently one, right? Of inherently oneness with the aggregates. Okay, then he makes another point, the second fault. He says the self would be many. And then he makes this point, right? Actually, I'll just read the quote from, this quote's actually from Chandrakirti. The aggregates are he's saying, if the aggregates are many, if they were the self, therefore there would be many selves. Right? And so part of this is like, again, if you have this feeling of the self as one with the aggregates, right? If that's that's what we're refuting here. Well, first of all, you could say if you want to say body and mind, there are two. If you want to say the 5 aggregates, then you can make 5. But if you want to get more detailed, actually, right, like you can say, well, if you want to say, just on your body alone, right, each organ, or each cell, or each atom, so do you have as many cells as you have atoms? Well, then there are subatomic particles. There's a problem, you know. So then you would end up having trillions and trillions of selves, not cells, right, but of cells. And then is your anger the mind, right? So is your anger yourself? Is your love yourself? Is your pride, or is your sleepiness? You know, it's funny, just your sleepiness for yourself. That'd be problematic. But so the point here is that you start to realize, well, if the self is one with the aggregates, but the aggregates are all these different. Actually, there are an infinite number of things, aren't they? I mean, just the mind itself. If you sit and meditate and watch your mind, there are countless thoughts that arise. right? And so what you're getting at is you're coming back, you're holding on, imagine in your meditation, you're holding on to this solid sense of I, right? Like that was insulted, for example, and then you feel that. I'm just kidding, whatever, however you identified it. And then you're saying like, so like for example, if somebody said, give an example, like, I'm just giving an example in your an example of somebody meditating. So like say the person used this example, that somebody said to me, you're ugly, right? And then I felt, oh, how could they say that about me? Okay, that's the I, right? You're using that as the I, right? So then you're checking, is the one with the aggregates, right? So then you're saying, well, and then you would be doing this analysis, right? You'd be saying, well, if I were one with the aggregates, then what was the first one? It would be pointless to assert a self, right? Also, that point about the aggregates change, right? Also, now this point, well, which part, right? You start to go through all the parts of you would say, well, is the one all those different parts? Is the I, that one self, is it all those different parts? If it's one with the aggregates, it has to be one or many, right? That's what we were starting with. But the aggregates are many, and the self seems to be singular. So, okay, there's a problem there. It doesn't hold up. Right? And then the third point, and again, he quotes here Nagarjuna, if the aggregates were the self, it would arise and disintegrate. And here he actually brings up, so he brings up this point that's related to part of actually what you said, Paul. Sometimes the self appears unchanging. Right? That was what you said. You also said it seems like an owner. That's a different point. But here the unchanging part he's addressing. Because if you hold on to that self and you actually notice your experience of it, it seems to be an unchanging thing. And then he's pointing out that the aggregates change moment by moment. Right? In each instant, your body and your mind there's no instant where they're not changing. Right? And then he makes here, that's point, if you look in the actual text, it says the third fault, and then points 4 through 10 are problems, logical problems that would arise if you were to assert that the self is the aggregates and that the aggregates arise and disintegrate. So we'll go through those one by one. Yep.
Dr.
Yep.
What does arise and disintegrate mean? Like, what is he talking about? Mind?
So actually what it's getting at is both the body and the mind, right? That the body arises. I mean, it arises and then it changes. Actually, ultimately what it means, there's gross arising and disintegrating, and there's subtle arising. It's impermanence is what it's getting at. So there's a gross level on which, for example, like you were born, then you exist, and then someday you'll die. Then there's a subtle level of arising and disintegrating where in each moment actually, right, your body arises from the previous moment of your body and changes. It's changing moment by moment. So like you could say a gross level of arising and disintegrating is any object, any physical object or mental object too, and the mind also, right? Like so, and in one sense you could say the mind of Rajiv, arose when you were conceived, and will end when you die, right? That label of Rajiv. But then also you could say in each moment, like a thought arises and disintegrates, and then another thought arises and disintegrates, and another, or an emotion, right, arises and disintegrates. So you could mean it in all those ways. A gross level, which is like over the course of a lifetime, or a subtle level, moment by moment.
So what about the object of the speech?
Object of the speech. I'm
Yeah.
not sure. I'm not sure what you
If
mean.
it change too, like if you give something a name like aggregates or Fidel or John, just a name, does the name also change because the object of the speech?
Yeah. Well, and actually, what I would say is speech itself, of course, changes instant by instant, right? It's just a sound. Yeah.
What about the label though?
Yeah, the label also changes over time, doesn't it?
How if you say speech, how
Does
does it
it?
change? How does it change? If you say speech,
Well, like for example,
But
seriously, right?
It
Okay.
can't mean something different as you go along, but as you use it, I'm just being.
It doesn't change instant by
I'm just
instant,
being
though.
pedantic, never
Yeah,
mind.
yeah, it doesn't change instant by instant, but it does change over time. Yeah,
so you can't say it's impermanent. You can say it's permanent.
you can say it's not changing instant by instant, but it doesn't last forever. Like so, for example, if the person dies and then they take another aggregate, then they're going to have a different label.
Yeah, but what speech remains? if you name something spiritual, then it remains centuries after centuries after centuries.
Well, a country changes, the names of countries change.
Right, yeah, everything, yeah, that's the, I guess part of the point is
Our
everything
enemies are
changes.
changed, who
Yeah.
our friends are.
Yeah, everything changes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's right. Okay, so the sub-points here are, one is, and I'll just go through them one by one, right? So these are the problems with arising and disintegrating, that prove that the self is not one with the aggregates. That's the whole point here, right? That's the overall point. So first he says, you may think it is asserted that the self or the person arises and disintegrates in each moment. And then he says, there is no fault in merely asserting this conventionally. However, an opponent who asserts that that persons are established by way of their own character, thereby necessarily asserts that persons arise and disintegrate inherently. And so what he's getting at, and maybe I'll just kind of say this in a general, or kind of make a number of points. So what he's getting at is this, he made this point about conventionally, right? In other words, and it was what I was getting at earlier, like, if you say that the I, because there's an I that exists, right? He's implying that here. There's a self that exists, which is a mere designation or a label of the conceptual mind, right? And he's saying, if you're just flexibly sort of labeling a continuum as the self, well, then it's just labeled. It's like a conceptual label that you can put wherever you want. So it's flexible. Not wherever you want, but you can do it in a flexible sense, right? And he's saying, but here we're talking about an I that exists inherently or intrinsically. So he's making a distinction there between the I that does exist and the I that doesn't exist, which he made earlier. Right? He says, here we're addressing the I which does not exist, which is the inherently, or how does he say it? That exists by way of its own character. That means intrinsically from its own side. Okay. And so what he's saying is, if you're asserting a self that exists from its own side intrinsically, and then you assert that it changes over time, then you have you have many problems, right? Because if it exists intrinsically, right, inherently from its own side, then it's not dependent, right? It's not dependent on other things. So then here's one example of a problem. Then, if that were true, then your current self would have to be totally unrelated to your earlier self. Right? The self you are now could have no relationship to the self you were yesterday, or as a child, or as an adolescent, or as a young adult, or whatever. Like, because if each one, in other words, if the self of the moment were intrinsically and inherently itself, it couldn't be relational. And the self is relational, right? It exists dependently. Ultimately, it all comes down to dependence, interdependence, or dependent origination. Actually, right? And so what he's getting at here is, if you were to assert, well, no, okay, I accept that. The self is one with the aggregates, and if it's impermanent, then each moment is the self, is an intrinsic self. You say, well, then the self can't be relational, right? So it can't be related to your previous self. So like the self of your childhood and the self of now has no relationship then, right? And has no, like, and the self of, the self of Paul today is no more related to the self of Paul yesterday than it is, to somebody else's self. It would be ridiculous, right? There would be no causal relationship
That would
of
explain
dependence.
a lot.
What's that?
That would explain a lot.
You get the point, though. So that's what he's getting at there. Then he says, actually, let me see, I made a note here. And I want to say, like, this is what he's getting when he said, by way of its own, he had this phrase, right? By way of its own character, right? And so by way of its own character means not dependent, right? Independent. Yeah, so, and so actually it's funny, if that were true, a child couldn't grow up, right? An adult couldn't grow old. We couldn't get sick. We couldn't get well. If you were sick, you couldn't get well, and so on. You couldn't learn anything, right? If you were intrinsically what you are in one moment, you couldn't grow, you couldn't change, you couldn't develop, for better, for worse, and all that, which, first of all, isn't true, right? I mean, we can immediately see that doesn't make any sense. Then he says, then he quotes, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I just had one clarification. So basically on that line here where it says, persons are established by way of their own character, thereby necessarily they assert the position where arising and disintegration happens. So in a subtle level, basically, what I understand is if you haven't gotten over your gross level of impermanence, I mean, you would always be seeing things. You'll be always under ignorance.
I'm not
So-
sure I understand. Like,
So, what I mean by arising and disintegrating here in this lines is like you don't even know about birth and death. How would you be able to actually penetrate through the innate ignorance at this point? So there's some sort of connection in there in terms of got to have good understanding of birth and death on a gross level, as well as moment to moment, a subtle level, to be able to penetrate through any understanding.
yeah, I'll say a couple points in relation to what you're saying. One is, of course, on the one hand, like when a person realizes impermanence, they don't necessarily also realize emptiness, but they're connected. That's what I think you're getting at. Is that actually, if you think, it's interesting. Like if you think deeply, on the one hand, like a person could realize, well, like if you lose somebody you love, for example, you can have some kind of recognition of impermanence, or something major changes in your life. You might have some recognition of impermanence. But here, in other words, what one is using the recognition of impermanence, which usually does come first. There is like, actually, Chandrakirti, in his text, points out there, he lists 4 different kinds of illusions, and one of them is seeing the impermanent as permanent. He also talks about seeing suffering as happiness, for example, and seeing what's contaminated as pure, and so things like that. But what he's getting at is similar to what you're saying, which is if you haven't, Chandrakirti's pointing out, and actually Nagarjuna is the same thing. If you don't realize, if you can't even recognize that things are impermanent, you're not going to be able to understand emptiness. Because you have to first realize these grosser truths. And actually, like one time Kent Rinpoche was saying that, he was saying like, if your mind can't even hold on to something so obvious, right? Like it's totally obvious, we're aging, we change. It's like if you can't even notice that and really keep it in your mind, then the idea that you're going to keep emptiness in your mind, of course, is not very realistic, because emptiness is hard to understand. That's easy to understand. So we have to so you're making a point there, and then understanding emptiness, understanding impermanence rather, it helps you to understand emptiness, and then you can apply it in this case, right, to recognizing, well, the self change, as if the aggregates rather change instant by instant, the idea that there's something intrinsic that's one with them and unchanging that's one with them makes no sense at all, right, and so on. And
I mean, even from a meditative aspect, if you don't understand the subtle impermanence, it'll be hard to see yourself changing moment by moment.
that's true.
Am I right on that?
Yeah. So then Lama Tsongkhapa quotes, again, Chandrakirti's commentary on Middle Way. And he's making this point about that we already kind of started to talk about. Things distinct by their character included in one continuum do not make sense. And actually, I'll read this quote just to be clear. He says, with respect to something earlier and something later established as distinct by way of their own entities, or by way of their own character, as he put it earlier, a relationship of dependence between what is later and what is earlier is inadmissible, right? It can't be independently related, that's what I was just saying. Since they are established with their own power as capable of setting themselves up, they cannot be dependent on anything else. If a single, and so anyway, you get the point here. And then he's saying, also then, within this life that wouldn't, he's making various points then. He's saying one is, within this life that wouldn't make any sense, right? That in other words, if an earlier moment and a later moment are inherently established by way of their own character, they wouldn't be related. Also from lifetime to lifetime, that wouldn't make sense. So whether you're talking about in one day, or from childhood to adulthood, or from a past life to a future life, in all those ways, causal relationships would no longer make sense if you assert this idea of inherent establishment. And then he also makes the point that memory wouldn't make sense, right? Like we have this experience of well, I remember when I, whatever, I remember when I first walked in this room, right? Well, if the you in this moment is inherently established, it's not related to a former self who walked in this room, so it would make no sense that, whereas it would be somebody else who walks in this room, essentially, who exists by way of their own character.
That logic doesn't make sense to me,
Say why?
because, because it feels like experience is just something that's getting painted on, like, for instance. So the guy who walked in the room, this inherent thing is sharing that experience or memory as far as is capable. I've never had a very good memory anyway. But, so logically that doesn't, that doesn't make sense to me.
I guess I'll put it this way: like, if the self of a specific moment were inherently established, or established by way of its own character, or how does he put, he uses different terms like that, then there would be, and had no causal, interdependent relationship with the previous moment of that person, then there's no reason why that person should remember, like, it would be just as logical, like, so for example, if it were me, right, if this self in this present moment were independently set up, right, then there's no reason why I'll put it this way, then there's no more reason for me to remember my driving here than remembering Jody driving here.
Just because we don't understand it. I certainly don't understand what's going on, why it remembers something from yesterday but doesn't remember something from this morning. There's a lot of things I'm ignorant about.
But this isn't getting at forgetting things. This is getting at causal.
Not just using that as an external thing that goes on while this inherent thing thinks it's permanently, but that's like, skin changing from young to old. Who knows why? It just is. But I'm still, this inherent thing is stuck in here watching my skin change over the years.
Oh, so you're doing, actually, what's going on now, though, is you're in
the ownership.
You're on the owner, which is the separate from the
sorry.
aggregate. So so this is not refuting that. This is refuting one with the aggregates.
All right, I'll stand by.
Yeah, so that comes next. You're refuting this separate. That's what's going on. No, it took me a second to get it. I was like, oh, he's on the separate from the
So I
aggregate.
have a question, like, causes conditions, right? Causes conditions. So causes conditions, if everything depends upon causes and conditions, then even enlightenment means we have to wait until our causes conditions come together,
Yep.
then we achieve it. Meaning we don't need to study.
Those are the causes and conditions.
No.
So you wouldn't be creating the causes and conditions.
No, if naturally law of causality is like that, that means naturally it's just going to happen itself. A time's going to come, then each individuals are going to become enlightened. Because if things, of course, the conditions are going to come together anyway. So they're going to work, right? There's no use to go to work at all to get a job because the conditions are going to take care of everything.
No, you're saying it's the opposite, actually. Like,
Yeah, if your cause condition does everything, depends upon cause conditions, then the natural law of the universe means like there's a lot of causes conditions, like then we have to wait our time when everything comes together, then it happens.
that would be like
Because
the
I'm trying
view
to
you're
understand
assuming.
I'm trying to understand what cause condition means to you. What does the cause condition means? What does cause condition means?
Like cause and condition in this sense means like, I'll give an example. Like like in the backyard we have a little tiny in my house. We have just
Yeah.
a small little garden area.
Yeah.
And like we know from experience. I know from my own experience. Like if we don't weed it and plant vegetables in the spring, there are going to be weeds there in the summer.
Yes.
But if we weed it out and plant tomatoes and lettuce and water it, then there will be lettuce and tomatoes
Yeah.
in the summer. And so, like, whichever causes you set up in the present lead to certain results later. And there will be some result, because in other words, whatever you do is a cause for something. You know, so if the cause you set up is neglecting that, then there will be a result, which is weeds. If the cause you set up is cultivating that, then the result will happen, which is whatever you planted will grow, if you plant the right things for that climate and so on. So the conditions are the cause is the seeds, the conditions are the soil, the water, the sunlight, and so on. And that's why I said also depends on the climate. Like if I planted something that could only grow in a tropical climate, it won't grow because it's not the conditions. It has a cause but no condition. So the idea is that whatever causes you create will lead to corresponding results. And so the example of study and meditation, contemplation, like those are the causes, for example, for realizing emptiness, right? So if any person doesn't set up those causes, that result won't happen.
Yes, but if you, like you're saying those four elements, right? Everything comes from those four elements, which is naturally like the nature of the world, just the nature of the world. So it's already put together. It's already put together. It's a matter of creating the causes. The conditions are already there.
You're talking about karma, right?
No, I'm talking about cause.
Yeah,
and
you
condition.
are.
I'm trying to understand.
It's just the same thing.
Yeah, okay.
Well, you
Yeah.
can't- if you
So
have
like
no
example
control,
like
But I think it's a long
conditional conditions are already there, but all we need to create is causes. That's all. I don't get it because it's a cause and conditions. It sounds like there's two things. Conditions are already there, but all we need to create is conditions, causes. That's all. Cause conditions are already there. The four elements are already there. The soil, the water, the fire is already there. The wind is already there. Even the teachings, we already have the teachings in our minds to become Buddhas. So the conditions are already there. So the causes. So what do they go together all the time? Causes and conditions.
But the lack of doing something about it will also cause something different,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So what do they put it together? Cause and condition. It all goes together, but like.
Oh, I see. So the reason why you have to have the causes and like on the external level,
Yeah.
like if it's a dry time, even if you plant the seeds and you have the soil and all that, when the dry, here, for example, in Washington area, in July it's often quite hot and dry. Oftentimes you have periods in July and so if you don't water those seeds, even though you have all the other the cause is there, the seed, and the soil's there, and the sunlight's there, if you don't water it, you won't have any vegetable. So that in other words, without a certain condition, even if you have the cause, the thing won't happen. So you need the condition. So we have to take care. And the point is like, and so an example of that so that's the example externally. An example in Dharma practice is if a person, actually they often teach this, for example. So the person studies the teachings and does some practice and meditates, but if they're not ethical, right, then they have a cause for, maybe they might have a cause for progressing on the path, but without ethics, they won't have the right conditions.
But we already have
And
ethics
they
in
won't-
our minds, though.
What's that?
But we already have ethics in our minds.
If you don't practice them, though, in your behavior, then it won't work. That's the point. So if we don't practice ethics in our behavior, we're lacking the conditions, and it won't happen.
Yeah.
Progress won't happen. That's an example.
Right.
Or generosity, then you won't have the resources and so on. So yeah.
Yeah.
But okay, and finishing this one point he was making. So then he says, he's making this point. He's saying again, it's this idea of a continuum, right? That a continuum does exist conventionally, right? That's how you exist as a continuum. It's how people exist. But he's saying if things were, he gives this point. Basically, he's saying, and he's using the example of past and future lives, but it would apply in past and future lives. It would apply in this life. Is that if there weren't this causal, interdependent relationship between past and present and future, then he's these traditional Sanskrit. He says that then one can then continue. Then people would become then like he gives the example. He says it's as if David Datta would remember his previous life of another person. But it would be like the same thing. It would be like you remembering the childhood of another person. If you were intrinsically established, then you wouldn't be dependent upon your own childhood. You'd be dependent upon somebody else's, or no childhood actually. And it would make no sense to remember your own childhood, for example, or your own previous experiences. That's in brief. Then he says the validity of memory in our system. he says, in our system, a single continuum of earlier and later is not contradictory, even though it disintegrates in each moment. Therefore, memory of former lives is valid. And what he's just, really what he's getting at is dependence, right? Dependent up, that in a continuum of experience, past, present, and future are interdependent, right? The present arises in dependence upon the past, and the future arises in dependence upon the present. And so in that sense, and really what he says, our system is dependent origination. Does that make sense? The system of the Madhyamaka, of the middle way, is the system that asserts dependent origination, or interdependence, or dependent arising. And he's saying, so our system is the system where there's not an intrinsic nature, because things arise dependently. But he's saying, so he's saying, in that kind of system, memory makes sense, because, and also causal, actually, one point I'll make is, this is a key point to the middle way school, or Madhyamaka school, the school that Lama Tsongkhapa is asserting, right, is that when you understand the emptiness of intrinsic nature that we're talking about, or inherent nature, or whatever, then dependence, interdependence, dependent origination functions and makes sense and is logical. But in a system where you assert inherently established things, it means they're not dependent. And that contradicts, then he's pointing out memory doesn't make sense, causal relationships don't make sense, interdependence doesn't make sense. Whether you look at your internal world, which arises in dependence upon previous experiences, or you look at the external world, where things, as we're describing with crops and trees and all kinds of houses, they all arise in dependence upon causes and conditions. And that makes sense when you recognize a lack of intrinsic nature, independent nature, or intrinsic nature, or existence by its own nature without causes and conditions. So he's saying memory makes sense. Here he's giving the example. He's saying memory makes sense when you understand that things don't have inherent nature and arise as a causal continuum, a causally interdependent continuum. So.
This begs a question that I have from a long time here, Dr. Lauren. So, say, for example, in talking on the reincarnation side of stuff, or future and previous lives.
Mm-hmm.
So 14th Dalai Lama that we have right now, he's a reincarnation of the 13th Dalai Lama. And say I've seen 13th Dalai Lama, like maybe 100 years ago I was there and I've seen him. Is he the same person that reincarnated as the 14th Dalai Lama? So when we say single continuum, right? It is the continuum though. It's the same. I don't know how to say it. It's that entity. And how do I relate those two together?
I think what's important, I'll say, like in general, you're asking a question about reincarnation and person. Like, it's important, like the person, you can't say it's the same person. First of all, they have a different name. Right? Like, that was, this is Tenzin Gyatso, that was Thupten Gyatso. So it's a different name. But also, like, actually, I'll just share that, because, like, I've had this experience a little bit now. I didn't know the previous Dalai Lama, because I'm too young, but Western, I think sometimes Western people, or people like, sometimes people, I guess, have this expectation that as if it was the same person. But actually, I guess we'll say it this way, like, a causal continuum means, or a continuum, right, means causally related. So it means the qualities that a person cultivates, in the present, serve as a cause for future, what they're going to be like. And that's true of all of us, right? Like, in other words, they say that, like, if you want to, there's a saying in Tibetan Buddhism, if you want to know what you did in your past lives, look at your current circumstances. Right. And if you want to know what your future lives will be like, look at your mind now, and look at your behavior now. That'll tell you what your future lives are going to be like, in some sense, not the details, but in general. So it's not, in one sense, to think like that the person is going to just be the same exact person. No, it's not like that. But there's a causal relatedness. And actually, you see that in the current Dalai Lama. Like, he's not. I mean, actually, the previous Dalai Lama was said to have had a kind of different kind of person. They say that he had a different kind of personality. But one is the sense of compassion, the sense of learning, being an incredibly learned teacher. This ability to sort of benefit others very extensively. That's similar, you know. But another point, actually, I'll just share a story that relates to that. It was actually a teacher, Reaper Rinpoche, actually. He's passed away, but he was my teacher before. And he once said this. He said, like, he was living in like the complex of the Dalai Lama's like Dalai Lama had asked him to come there and do some writing projects, and so he was living there. And there was this young Toku who the Dalai Lama was keeping close to him. And he said he went to the Dalai Lama and he said, you know, there are so many great Tokus. Why do you have him here? Like, why did you pick him to be here? And he said, he basically said, like, oh, I've been close to him since the time of Padmasambhava and Trisong Detsen. Like, we've had this we had a karmic connection, you know, going back to, what was that, 800 AD or something. You know, like the Dalai Lama was recognizing that there was a causal, interconnected, like that they had been close from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime, and so he felt there was like that connection to continue to benefit, like, what's the word? Like, sort of give him a good education, to help educate him and cultivate those qualities again so that he would benefit others. So there's some like, so there can be a recognition of interdependent causal relationship, but it's not the identical person. And I even think that, you know, like, up to a certain point, you know, even in China, I'm sure you reflect on this, like, because you have children, like, sometimes I think that when you look at a child up to a certain age and you think like, oh, you can't tell yet what kind of, like, you go, what kind of person will this person be?
Yeah.
And you can't tell, you know, and then there comes a point for a given lifetime where it's like a person, due to all kinds of causal factors, you know, oftentimes it's interesting, like, you watch some people, you realize part of it, like, it's who they happen to be friends with in school, and it's what school they went to, and it's all these different factors, what college they went, you know, up to a certain point there are all these different factors, and then there comes a point where, like, now still the person could change, but there comes a point where you start to go, oh, now I see a certain personality. You know, then maybe in adulthood, if certain circumstances come, then a person's personality can change again, you know, but it's due to and again, it's due to causes and conditions, both. You know, the causes are what's the person's karma, right? If a person doesn't have a certain karma, then no matter what kind of conditions come, and you see that sometimes, right? Somebody could be in circumstances where you would think those circumstances should lead to this kind of personality, but they don't, because that person is fundamentally not that.
Right.
But then like, if a person has various causes, then the circumstances sort of solidify certain tendencies. And I think that when you can see that in a child growing up, it's similar from lifetime to lifetime. Like, where it's like, it's not the same person, but those karmic potentials or habits or qualities cultivate, you know, and it's why, like, they say, you know, it's why, you know, Solas Lama could study so effectively, you know, I mean, sometimes you look at His Holiness particularly and you think, I think that actually, you know, like even if you read the story of Geshe Sopa, who's passed away, but was like a great scholar, a great Buddhist scholar, he was much older than the Dalai Lama and was one of the greatest scholars of his generation, and then he went to debate with the Dalai Lama for the Dalai Lama's Geshe exam, right? And the Dalai Lama was so much younger, but was able to debate quite well with Geshe Sopa. You know, and you would say, well, wow, how could he? Like, Geshe Sopa had studied incredibly hard and was much older, and some of the Dalai Lama was able to, like, when people would watch, people would be, I've heard stories of people who were there, and you read stories, where they're like, how could somebody that young debate with the greatest scholars of Tibet when he hasn't studied Islam? And they've studied so hard, and they're brilliant. I mean, they need to be the smartest people, you know,
Right.
but it's because of that, you know. But to say he was the same personality, he wasn't the same personality. It's up to Gyatso, at least.
Joy, I got it that it's not the same person in a sense, you know, like your last bit just led into the question that I had, which is memories, which you said are not inherently just blah, but Tokus like a Laudu Lama or Koso, or who have very specific memories of a past life. Can you speak to that in that context of not having the characteristics? I mean, you see a kid and they can have the characteristics of a child, but we're not talking about that.
But so what's the question? Like, what's the question?
So this very specific memories, and when you say that the person doesn't go from time to time, from life to life, it's not a complete person, got it.
Yeah.
Personality traits, I mean,
Yeah, those can
seem
go.
to
Yeah.
go along, which again is not tied to a person, but a memory is.
Well, actually, this is what it's a good question, because that's what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at here. Actually, he's getting at this point, which is it's because it's a causal continuum. Like, in other words, like, many according to Buddhism, like if somebody has actually, I want to relate your question to Paul's question. Well, no, I shouldn't say. But anyway, part of the point is here is like, if a person has enough clarity of mind, or enough, like, clarity, and sometimes they talk about purification or wisdom, then their memory, actually even in this life we can see our memory's better, and then sometimes our memory can be worse. Like depending on our health and depending on our clarity and depending on, but also like some people have amazing memories, like like incredible memory, and other people, my memory's not so good for a certain thing. Like we can compare, but and Paul, you were saying too, so we're similar in that way. But certain things it's hard to remember. So one point is the clarity of that mind and the purification of that mind, then the person can remember better. So sometimes they say, now actually there are many stories. Dr. Ian Stevenson from University of Virginia, and he published books of not Tibetans, like other people where he actually did scientific studies. He studied young children who remembered a past life, who claimed to remember, and then he would go and research and find, like, because sometimes they could remember the name, or they could say I was murdered, or this happened, and he would like actually find, and he would try to establish, and if you read his book, it's quite interesting. He tries to establish: is there any circumstance in this 4-year-old's life or 5-year-old's life that could allow for them to know what happened? And some of the cases were like, I don't know, it was like the child, I can't remember where, but like if the child was in like a rural town in some European country, and the previous life was in Indonesia and this other rural town, he was able to say, well, there's no way that person could have known, but they said the name and the circumstances of the death or something. He was sort of able to find these. He was a scientist. He was just interested in that topic of like, how can this happen? His name was Ian Stevenson. And some other people now, I can't remember their names. He was the original person. He wrote a number of books about it, and then some other people have taken up his research. I guess I don't know if he retired or he died, but now other people took up his research. But he was at UVA. So it's not unique to Tibetans, this phenomena of remembering past lives.
There's 1,700 stories, by the way.
He had, just him. Yeah.
So doesn't that suggest then that there's something in the memory that there is something tangibly continual, and there's a continuum there?
Oh, and that's what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, though. That's what I was getting. So what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is, it's possible to remember past lives, for whether it's a Tibetan tulku or these other cases. What Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is that's possible because there's a relationship, a dependent, there is a continuum. Like, there is that because that person, their continuum and continued, and that and actually, according to Buddhism, if you meditate enough, actually it's in the Buddhist teachings, actually. They say that, actually, on different, like, I'm talking about, like, they're like, they say actually a person who's realized calm abiding, which we've studied in this text, a certain kind of that meditative ability to have calm abiding, that kind of person, if they apply themselves to do that, if they want to do that, that they can actually use that, and that's what I was getting at. They have because that person has an extremely clear, right? They've cultivated a clarity of mind and also incredible concentration. And so people who have achieved calm abiding can achieve all kinds of abilities. And they say one ability a person with calm abiding can achieve is that they can intentionally start to remember their past lives. If they practice, they can start to remember them, if they want to.
Can you remember future ones?
You can't remember a future one, because memory implies past. I mean, the word memory implies past, at least in the Buddhist kind. But they can sort of see. Yeah, there are stories of people who can like see a future life. Yeah, that exists. I mean, in those cases. Yeah, kind of clairvoyance of seeing past and future lives, up to a point where only but one point is the future lives only to the point where it's been causal. I once asked Khenpo Rinpoche this. I said, well, how can they see the future? Because it doesn't exist yet. And also it said, like, anyway, I was asking Khenpo Rinpoche questions about that, and he said, it was actually an interesting point. He was saying, in the Buddhist context, there are certain future phenomena where all the causes and conditions are already set. He said those already exist as future phenomena. They don't exist in the present, but they exist as future phenomena. because all the causes and conditions are set for them to happen, and so they're already existent phenomena. And they said that he was saying that's why, for example, in certain sutras, if you read if you read the Sutra of Golden Light, I think, or it might be the Sangata Sutra, I can't remember which one, it actually says like this person could not be predicted when they would become a Buddha. Then there came a point where it said another Buddha could predict. You will become, in so many eons, you will become a Buddha. Your name will be this. You'll be on this planet. You'll be, and it was because at that, and the point was, at that point, all the causes and conditions had been established, and it was like, what's the word? Unstoppable or inevitable or certain. And it's only when it's certain that another Buddha would predict, oh, you'll become. But when it's not certain, it can't be predicted because it doesn't exist yet.
So the Dalai Lama's
So it's
oracle is doing what?
Actually, that I don't know. I have no idea what that was oracles do. That's way beyond my ability to know. Well, let me finish with it. Because, but so that I don't know. But I guess the point is like if the causes and conditions are set, then it can be then something can be predicted. If the causes and conditions aren't set, it can't be.
And Buddhism believes in actual time, linear time. I for some reason, I guess I just assumed that.
What Buddhism, what Buddhism believes is it's similar. Actually, if you read Nagarjuna, it's similar to this idea of the self. What Buddhism would say is, because time lacks any inherent existence, it functions. So time doesn't exist inherently. If it did, then there would be these discrete moments. That's what he's getting at here. If time existed inherently, there would be these discrete moments that would be uncausally, that couldn't be causally connected to anything else.
Right.
So that, in that sense, time doesn't exist in that way. There's not an inherently existent time. If there were, it couldn't function. But because time is empty of inherent existence or empty of intrinsic nature, therefore it can, therefore we can conceptually label past and future as related, as interdependently related. Yeah.
Okay.
So
I guess what I'm thinking-
conventionally time exists, but ultimately not. Ultimately everything's empty of inherent
Right.
existence if it functions. Yeah.
I guess, I mean, I have dreams of future things that haven't happened yet, so I know that, you can, I
Yeah.
firmly believe in sort of timelessness and stuff like that, and I'm no holy person, so, I mean, like, there's no reason, like, I should be, like, a gift or something like that, you know what I mean?
Well, maybe you're a little more gifted than you think.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but if things that haven't happened yet,
Mhm.
right, and I see it clear, crystal clear,
Yeah.
so therefore, they have happened, or I couldn't see them.
Well, and the way Buddhism would say it, it's interesting. What Buddhism would say is not that they. It's just maybe it's a slight difference, but because I was actually at this point confused me at one point, so that's why I actually sat down and had a whole conversation with Rinpoche because I was confused by it. And I actually can't remember the exact wording, but essentially what he was saying was not. It's a subtle distinction. It's not that it has happened. It's that it exists already as a future event. Because the causes and conditions are inevitable, and actually you can see that, there comes a point, I'm going to give, anyway, I won't get into that. I mean, the point is that one, that's the way he put it. I think that's how he put it, is that, it already exists as a future event. Doesn't mean it's happened yet. It hasn't happened yet. But it exists already as a future event, so it can be an object of perception. Because then he said, I was saying, well, the Buddha is omniscient, but they can't know what a person hasn't chosen yet. For example, if there's not and he said, because it doesn't exist. The Buddhas can only know everything. He was saying, I was asking this question, I was saying the Buddhas are said to be omniscient. But if they know the entire future, then there's no free will. That was actually part of what my struggle was.
Right.
And he said, no, the Buddhas know all existent phenomena. So they know all future things that are inevitable. But if it's not inevitable, then they don't know it because it doesn't exist. So it's not an existent thing. So how could you can't know what doesn't exist? That's not an existent phenomenon, and it's not knowable. Once it becomes inevitable, then even before it's happened, the Buddha sees that future event will happen once it's inevitable will happen. It was an interesting
That's
distinction
so
he drew.
cool.
I couldn't get that until he
But
explained it to me.
Dr. Lauren, that means almost what you said was I don't know how to put it. So I know that I'm going to get into an accident 2 days from now. Say I'm like an enlightened person. I know 2 days from now I'm going on certain highway, causes and conditions come together, I'll die. Something like that. I get a clairvoyance. Do I have a choice of saying will I be on the highway on that day at that time, or do I not have a choice?
Well, actually, there was I'll just share another story. I won't give details, but like, one time, somebody, this is related. There was a story I heard from somebody where Lama Zopa told a person something like that. He has like clairvoyance, right? And he said to somebody, "Oh, they were going to die or something." And then this nun said, "Did he say you're definitely like that? It's definite, like that the karma is absolute, or that is it like what we were describing? Like it's a definite event where all the causing conditions." Or did he say, if you don't change your karma, it's going to happen? And the person said, I didn't ask, and they went and asked. And then he said, oh, it's not, like it was an interesting point. It was like, it wasn't definite. It was that, like, if they didn't change something, it was going to happen. And then that person did all this stuff to change, like they went to him and said, well, what should I do? And they gave him some advice. And then they got diagnosed, actually, that in the time frame that Lama Zopa predicted, they got diagnosed with a serious health problem, but because they, like, I guess, well, first of all, because they had done all this practice. Secondly, because he had told them they were getting checkups more, and they found it earlier than they would have, and they survived and lived. So in that case, it's subtle. Part of the idea would be there are times where, like, so for example, from a Buddhist perspective, there's a saying. They say, like, if the person's karmic lifespan is over, then no matter what anybody does, there's no stopping them. Whereas if it's like, if it's not that if the person has, their karmic lifespan could continue, but there are certain life obstacles or things that are coming that would end their life as an obstacle, then sometimes it's possible to remove them. So it depends on that. What you're raising, I think that's the way I've heard it in teachings, is that one is like that there's a maximum lifespan to that life that is sort of, that's something the causes were already set up in a previous time, and you can't change that. Where there are other things where it's like conditions or obstacles or certain harms that could come, and that could be changed if the person can change the causes correctly or something like that.
So to the Buddhas, that means that to the Buddhas, they can't project the past, they can't even project the future, can only project the present. Because they only eliminate all the delusions in their mind, the illusions, the fantasies.
Yeah, that's right.
So that means like they can't go back and be like, oh, I did this in the past, I'll do this in the future. So there's no such a thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. With the Buddhas in the present moment, it's interesting. According to this school, we're getting into stuff that we get into, but according to the middle way school, right? Like it's interesting. The past, like we were saying, the future exists in the present. Things that were definite to happen in the future exist as future. But also in the present, the past exists as the past. It doesn't exist intrinsically, it's not findable, you can't. But it exists as the past, right? And in what sense does it exist? It exists, like the mind can label past. Like in other words, if I say, it's actually in accordance, like Chandra Kirti points out, the middle way school is in accordance with convention. So in other words, if I say, we always do that, right? If I say, like yesterday I was talking to my sister, and we were talking about, like, we said, oh, remember this time we went to Pennsylvania all these years ago? And I said, yeah, we went there, right? Like, it was just a normal conversation, right? Like, well, in other words, from a conventional perspective, that exists. We talked about it, right? If you try to find that trip, good luck, right? You can't find it. But it exists through mere designation, as a kind of conventional, so the past exists in that sense, but it's not findable. It's not touchable. You can't touch it, but it exists, and it's a causal continuum. We can remember, and that's what he's getting at, right? And whether it's a past life or experience like that, and you can remember because it's a causal continuum. It's a continuum of moments.
So you have to be in that state of mind. You have to be in the state of mind of the past, not to create the past. So you have to be in the state of mind of the future, and not to be the future, because you project the past. Oh, in the past I did this and that, so you're in the state of mind of the past, and then you say, I'll do this and this. Then you're in the state of mind of the future.
So you have to, remember. I would say more carefully. You have to be remembering.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have to be remembering the past to remember the past.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll do at least one more paragraph here. So now he says. Okay, so he's actually still on this point about past life. So he's saying when certain people assert that the Buddhas and ordinary beings are one is an extreme view. But anyway, what he's getting at here is I'll read it. He says, in people who have not realized the meaning of this, the frequent statement in sutras, in the past I was this person, generates the first wrong view out of the 4 bad views that were taught. Everybody's in the extreme associated with the past. The 2, the person at the time of Buddhahood and the person at the earlier time, are 1. Moreover, the compounded phenomena would disintegrate moment by moment, and so there are a couple points he's getting at here. Actually, let me finish this. There are 2 not to fall into. So he's making a few different points here. One is, if you understand he's saying if you haven't realized, so he's making at this point, he's saying, if you understand what he's talking about, right, then you can even understand, in the case of a Buddha, right, an enlightened being, right, you can understand how a Buddha, like sometimes, and he's getting it, if you read the sutras, right, the sutras are the words of the Buddha, right, and if you read the words of the Buddha, some sutras have these stories, many, like the Jataka tales are like this, but the Sutra of Golden Light has quite a bit of this too. There will be these passages where the Buddha will say, I was that bodhisattva who did that deed, who did this compassionate deed of offering my life or studying or helping others in this particular way. And he'll say, and that's what helped. There's actually a beautiful passage, right, where in the Sutra of Golden Light, where he finds the bones, right, of his past life. And he shows them to his disciples. And he pays homage to those bones. And Shariputra says to him, you're a Buddha. Why would you pay homage to the bones of some other? You're the highest of kind of beings. Why would you be paying homage to these bones? And the Buddha says, I was that person. And it was because of the generosity of that life that I became a Buddha. And those were the causes, and this is the result. And so that's why I pay homage to it, is I wouldn't be a Buddha if it weren't for the actions of those past lives. Right? And so again, in that case, the Buddha is talking about causality, dependent origination. That even Buddhahood itself, right, is a dependently arisen phenomena that arose in dependence upon eons of compassionate, wise activity, right, from the previous time. And so what he's getting here is, if you understand dependent origination, right, then you understand that, then you can see it like that, right? But then he says, if you were to say, though, that the Buddha is identical to to the sentient being, because it's getting at the point you were asking about, whereas if you were to say they're identical, well, then that's ridiculous, of course, because the sentient being wasn't a Buddha yet. They were a bodhisattva who created the cause for Buddhahood. So if you say they're totally identical, or I guess no, it's more your question, actually, sorry, about are they identical? Right? Now, in that case, maybe they're both Buddhas, but still, it's the same point, right? Yeah. If you say they're identical, then you can't understand how the causes lead to the results, right? So that's a wrong view. That's what he's getting at. But if you say they're causally related and interdependent, that's okay. That makes sense.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So does the Buddha have, once a Buddha, are they still in a continuum then?
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
As future Buddha?
Yeah, so you could say, because actually, the reason why you could say that is from, so say, for example, let's say somebody here in this class that were to do Amitabha practice, and then were to take rebirth in Amitabha's Pure Land, Tsongkhapa, right? Well, Amitabha achieved enlightenment a long time before, right? Tsongkhapa is said to have existed for a long time. But that person, when they arrive in Tsongkhapa, would meet Amitabha, and he would give them teachings, right? And so, in that sense, there's a continuum, right? Because the previous time, Amitabha was not yet that person's teacher. Now Amitabha is that person's teacher. So in that sense, there has to be a continuum, right? Because they're still relational with the sentient beings who are suffering. And so you could say, the previous Amitabha hadn't yet taught so-and-so, but now they have taught so-and-so. So in that sense, there's a continuum, a temporal continuum, in which they manifest to benefit others, for example. So yeah, does that make sense? And so then, in order not to fall into and then he makes one more point here that I want to mention. So you get this idea of causal continuum. And then there's another point that he makes very briefly where he says, and this is a kind of philosophical point, but I'll just say very briefly. We've been talking a lot of philosophical points. Towards the end of that paragraph, he says, you remember the I in general, without making a distinction in terms of country, time, and nature of life. And this is getting at points that you guys have been asking about, so that's why I'll mention it. Is they have this term sometimes because of this thing of over lifetimes, which is what you guys have been asking about, where they say there's a general. So what they're saying is that when the Buddha says, "I was that bodhisattva," right? They're saying he's using the general term "I," because sometimes we have a specific term "I," which is one lifetime, right? Like, whereas like if you say "I, Lorne," well, that's only a one lifetime "I," right? Because I wasn't. There's no reason to think I was ever called that in a past life or will be in a future life. So it's like a one lifetime label, right? But they say sometimes when talking of past and future lives, then they say it's a mere designation, right? But they can't say I, the Buddha, was that person because that person wasn't a Buddha, right? And they can't say I, Shakyamuni, of the Shakya clan was that person because that person wasn't of the Shakya clan. So they're saying from a philosophical or from a linguistic perspective, there's just a kind of general sense of I, which is a label on a continuum. It's just the label that the person is, now it's a label that one is applying to a kind of continuum over lifetimes. It's not the I of Shakyamuni, the child of that king. It's not I, the Buddha. It's just I as a label on a continuum over lifetimes. And they're saying that's an important distinction because if you were to say, like if I were to say, I don't remember my past lives, but if I did, and if I were to say, I, Lorne, was that person, well, that person wasn't Lorne, so that would be a wrong assertion. But if you were to say I in a general sense, as a label on a continuum, that's an acceptable way to talk about that. So it's just a philosophical point, but it gets at kind of what you guys were asking about. So if the Dalai Lama were to talk about the lives of the previous Dalai Lamas, it would be like this, a general I. It's not I, Tenzin Gyatso. It would be I as this general label upon it, continuum over lifetimes. Okay, actually, let's finish this. So actually, I think we do. So we'll finish these last few points, and then that will have completed the third of the 4 points, right? Which is all this. Remember, it's like you remember where all this is refuting that the I is identical with or is one with the aggregates, right? So we're just on that third point still. We've gone but it's still on that point. There's like sub-points or something. Okay, so the next one. The fault that actions done would be wasted is that both the agent of an action and the experiencer of its effect could not be grouped together on the basis of a mere I, right? And so it's a similar point, but here what he's saying is, if we understand a causally interdependent continuum that's labeled I, then we can understand how past actions lead to future results, karma, right? But if the I were intrinsic to one moment, right? If the I intrinsically existed and was unrelational, as we've been talking about, inherently existed in that moment, and were not dependent upon the previous moment, therefore, and previous moments, then there would be no karma, actually, right? And actually, you could, right? There was the karmic result of one. You couldn't say that that you did this karma and therefore it led to that result. Actually, even to be more simplistic for a second, like like high cholesterol wouldn't be related to what you eat. It wouldn't have any relationship, right? Because I'm just being silly here, but it's true actually, right? That's what he's saying. In other words, previous actions and present results, present actions and future results would have no relationality if things existed intrinsically, and that contradicts the teachings on karma and also contradicts our direct experience, which is that what we do has effects, right? We know that from experience. Next one. The fault of meeting actions not done is the absurd consequence of the effect of actions accumulated by some distinct continuum would always be experienced by another continuum. So it's the same point. In other words, there is that that all these things, causal relationship, karma, past and future lives, all these kinds of things make sense if you recognize that the self, and really he's still distinguishing the self that does exist from the self that doesn't exist, right? The self that does exist is, as he put it, is a mere designation, a mere label, a mere label of the conceptual mind, I, on a continuum. And as long as you understand that, you can understand a continuum can exist. And therefore relationality and cause and effect and dependent origination exist. And all those things make sense. Whereas if you assert that the I is intrinsically one with the aggregates as they are in some given moment, none of these things make sense, right? And therefore, like, where would the cause of this I be? Would it be some other continuum? Would it be, is it causeless? It would make no sense, right? And it would contradict both the teachings on karma and our direct experience, which is what you do influences what your later experiences are. And so he says here, actually I'll read this because this is summarizing kind of what he's been saying. He says, these two faults that he just mentioned are associated with the essential point explained earlier in the commentary on the middle way by Chandrakirti, that if a person were, and this is the line, if a person were established by way of its own entity, its earlier and later moments would not be of the same continuum. Okay? You couldn't have a continuum, actually, right? Because there would be no relationship. Continuum implies a specific kind of cause and effect relationship, and that wouldn't make sense if things existed by way of their own entity, because something that exists by way of its own entity is set up by itself, right, and doesn't depend upon something else. And then he quotes a line from Nagarjuna's Root of Wisdom. And here God and human are referring to two different lifetimes. He's using this quote, he says, if the God and the human were other, their continuum would not be valid. So there what he's getting is, Nagarjuna is using the example, here he's using, Nagarjuna himself is using an example of a being who was a God in one, divine, like not the God who creates the universe, but a God, like a being in the God realm, right? So he's saying, if a person were a God in that sense, right, a person in the God realm in one lifetime, and a human in another lifetime, he's saying, if they were inherently other, right? If they were inherently other, then their continuum wouldn't be valid, right? In other words, if you say, now you can't say they're identical, right? In other words, a being in a God realm and a being in a human realm are not identical. But if you were to say so you can't say they're inherently one, in that sense. But if you were to say they're inherently other, then they couldn't be causally related, and then the person couldn't have created the karma in one life to be the other, and you couldn't say they took rebirth as that. So he's making this point. He's saying, and again, it's this point about, it's interesting, isn't it? If things are dependently arisen and relational, which is the Buddhist view of how things exist, how all things exist actually, then if they weren't that, if they were inherently existent, they couldn't be that. But that's how they exist, right? And so you get the point. Does that make sense? And so and I want to conclude now. That was the third of the 4 points, right? And I mean, you can see from all the questions, it's complicated, isn't it? But what he's getting at, I just want to point this out because you could lose track of it, right? Is so you'd be sitting in meditation, right? And you'd have some text in front of you or something, or you'd have memorized these points, hopefully, and then you don't need the text. But the point is that you would have, like, all of this is the logical analysis, right? But then when you're actually meditating, you would actually give rise to your own experience, again, remember, of the object of negation. So that's not some theoretical thing. That's your own visceral, if you think of it this way, like, what's your strongest difficult emotion? I mean, you don't say it out loud, but think about it for a second, right? Whatever your personal strongest, difficult emotion is, your object of negation is what underlies that, right? So that'd be an example. You might give rise to, in meditation on purpose, your own strongest difficult emotion, and then you would maybe recognize the object of negation, this inherently existent sense of self that underlies that. And that's very visceral, right? That's like the thing that causes you the most suffering. It's the thing that's most challenging in your life. So you'd be holding on to that sense of I, right? And then you would recognize, okay, if that I exists, it has to be one with the aggregates, or completely different from the aggregates. Otherwise, it doesn't exist, right? And then you would start applying these lines of reasoning. You would continue holding that sense of self. Does that make sense? And you would start going, and you would start saying, well, if that sense of self that I have right now is true, then I can't be related to the person I was as a child. Then I'm not. Then I have no relationship at all to my own childhood. There's no continuum, so I'm not at all related. And then whatever I did before has nothing to do with what I do now. Even the idea when I just said the point, right? Your most difficult emotion, right? Well, it wouldn't be my most difficult emotion because I wouldn't have had that experience over and over again. I would only have it now, and it would have no relationship to the fact that I had it before. So you would say that doesn't make any sense, and you would keep going, and you would and you would think there would be many, I have this difficult emotion. So there's the consciousness, and there's the difficult emotion, and there's my hands sitting on my lap. I'm meditating. There's my back, and there's my ears and my eye. So there will be all these selves. So which one has the difficult emotion? Does my ears have it? Does my eye? There aren't many selves. This self feels like one. It's one that has that. But there are all these parts of the aggregates. So who has that difficult emotion? Is there some, how could that be one with the aggregates when the aggregates are many? But it feels like a single self, right? And at a certain point, it would have to be deeply experiential, right? At a certain point, you would actually have the experience, and it would be an emotional experience in a sense, right? It would be both a cognitive experience, but also it would be emotional. Buddhists don't really differentiate those. It would be both. Where you would viscerally feel there is no self that's one with the aggregates. You would actually have a realization. There is no self that's one with the aggregates. It's impossible. It never existed. If I thought it existed, I did think it existed, but it doesn't. It's completely clear to me now that doesn't exist at all. It's not like maybe it doesn't exist. It's not like, well, I don't think it exists. That's not, you would be meditating until you have this visceral recognition, like a realization, wow, that absolutely, positively, it's clear to me. I get it now. I see it clearly. That doesn't exist. So you would apply these logical reasonings are reasonings, right? But you're applying them to yourself. That's why I'm giving an example like my childhood wouldn't. My ears, I have all these parts, but it feels like one. You'd be doing that until you really recognize that is not one with the aggregates. That object of negation cannot be. It's absolutely impossible that that's one with the aggregates. And then what would happen is, somewhere in your mind, because you have a habit of grasping at the self, you would say, okay, it's different than the aggregates. Like Paul said, it owns them, it controls them. Because that's what would happen is you would start to feel. Because you actually now viscerally have given up on the possibility that it's one with the aggregates, right? So your mind would start to feel like the self, the self-grasping, you would start to feel, yeah, it's the owner of the aggregates. Is that the phrase you use? Or it's separate from
for next week.
Yeah, it's the separate from the aggregates. It's the owner. It's in there. It's not one with them, but it sort of controls them, maybe, or it's the controller. Yeah, things. But that would be the feeling. That would be your visceral sense now. And part of the key is it has to be that strong of a experience, right? Otherwise, if you just go if you were just going, oh, if it wasn't visceral, if you didn't really find the object of negation, and if you just sort of said, well, if the self were one with the aggregates, then that doesn't make logical sense. If it feels like you're analyzing it out there somewhere, sometimes it's like that. If you think about things, you go like this. So, if you're thinking, you go, So if it feels like it's up there, that I, and that you're analyzing it like it's some object that exists in sort of an abstract sense, it's not going to be very effective. It's not going to actually it's not going to free you from your cause of suffering, which is something again, because I'm not making this up. Lama Tsongkhapa said this. He said it himself, right? He said, all your afflictive emotions, all your anger, your rage, your terror, your fear, your desire, your pain, this object of negation is there. It pervades all of them. It's there as the foundation of all of them. It's there hidden inside all of them. Does that make sense? So you have to find that in your own experience. The object of negation is your sense of self, right? If somebody threatens to kill you, that sense of self, that's not some abstract sense of self that's out there somewhere, right? You feel like, or somebody, actually, forget somebody, somebody just actually, all somebody has to do is say one, in the right circumstance, right? Somebody has to just say one word that you don't like. and like this horrible feeling can arise, right? Like if you sometimes you don't care if you don't care about the person, but you know, if it were in front of the wrong group of people and somebody said just the wrong thing about you, you would feel this like, oh, how could they say that? You know, I'm just getting, in there is that sense of I that we're getting at here. Does that make sense? That feels like it's inherently existent, and that leads us to feel angry and to feel jealous and to feel like I want, right? That's, you know, that's that I, right? I want this, I want that. It's grounded in this sense of an inherently existent I. And so you have to find that, and then when you do this analysis, it's like a visceral experience, right? Where you start to have some kind of real recognition that I cannot be one with the ideas. It never was. It's impossible. And you see what I'm getting at? It's a valid, the point is you're trying to get to a valid cognition, like a real recognition, an experience, a true valid insight that doesn't exist in that way. Then, of course, like I said, then your mind may start to go, well, and then it must be the owner or the controller or it exists somehow separate from the ideas. And for Paul's sake, then next time we'll analyze, like, well, if that, you know, we'll analyze why that, you have to have the techniques then to say, well, why is that impossible? And what happens eventually is if you recognize that both are impossible, right, then because you recognize the pervasion, that it could only exist in those two ways, there's no other option, then you would recognize that I doesn't exist at all, right? Which is a recognition of emptiness. Doesn't mean there's no self. And as we've been pointing out, that doesn't mean there is no self, right? But it means that self, the inherently existent self, doesn't exist at all. It doesn't exist conventionally, it doesn't exist ultimately, it doesn't exist in any way. And then, and this is what's so, and last thing I'll say and then we'll stop. One thing that's really wonderful, I think, about the way Lama Tsongkhapa in this text is presenting, is teaching about emptiness, is, you know, the difficult thing to understand, the really difficult point is to understand how, like, there's no inherently existent self at all. And yet there's a self that accumulates karma, and that functions, and that goes places, and that does things. But and there's no inherently existent self, right? Like, understanding that is what's subtle and difficult. And Nagarjuna even says that's difficult. Everybody says that's difficult. And so Lama Tsongkhapa is making it so clear by over and over again. Right, even in this text where he's proving there is no inherently existent self, he keeps saying there's the mere. What do you say? The mere I. Right? The merely labeled I in a continuum. So he keeps pointing this out, that he's not negating everything, right? But he's negating the inherently existent I completely. And so it's a very subtle distinction he's making. But he does that over and over again so that we don't fall into nihilism, right? Into some sense of nothing exists, and nothing matters, and my actions don't matter, and which is actually kind of an, well, actually, what on the one hand is a kind of, Buddhism would say is a very evil view, actually. And I've said this before, I think sometimes, to some extent, that view is common in our culture, right? The view that what we do doesn't matter. Like, so we don't take care of the planet, we don't take care of each other, we don't take care, whereas the Buddhist view is everything is interdependent. And I was thinking about this yesterday, I was like, we don't recognize that. We don't recognize that everything is, that's what Buddhist view is, that everything we do affects everything. That's the implication of this, right? Actually, the Buddhist view really is the opposite of nihilism. It's that everything you do is infinitely meaningful, because it's infinitely interconnected, right, in an infinite continuum. So it's really, so you can see why nihilism would be like this horrible view, because it would be the exact opposite of reality, right? The reality is everything we do is interdependent with everything else, right? And so what we do has all kinds of implications, karmically and environmentally and interpersonally, and all these different ways. And that's the teaching of dependent origination, right? Which is the teaching of emptiness, actually, right? That there is, and that this idea that I'm some intrinsically existent self eventually can lead to this idea of nihilism. Like that. Therefore, when this self ends, nothing matters. Like, Right, so if you have an idea, I'm in this intrinsically existent self, then it leads to some kind of idea that, well, then when this self ends, everything's over, nothing matters. There's not some recognition of what he's getting at here, which is this infinite continuum, right, of interconnectedness. And if you start to realize, conventionally, my nature is a mere designation of I upon an infinitely interconnected continuum, then you start to recognize, well, whatever I do matters infinitely, actually, because it affects infinite others, and it affects me over an infinite amount of time also, and others over an infinite amount of time, because we're limitlessly interconnected. That's the implication of past and future lives that he got at here, too. So then you start to take great care of what you do. So it's the opposite of nihilism. Anyway, I'm just a little side note, but it's important, isn't it? Okay, let's do the verses a bit. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it... Oh, the supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends.